This tape is from a Shabbos Farbrengen of Beshalach, Tu B'Shvat, Tavshim Mem Gimel, January 29th, 1983, and the tape is unedited.
Good Tag. This afternoon, the Rebbe began the Farbrengen, but the main inyan of this Shabbos is the fact that it is Shabbos Shira. And as Mefarshim explained, the reason why this Shabbos is called Shabbos Shira is due to the fact that in the Kriyas HaTorah of Parshas Beshalach, we read the Shira of Az Yashir Moshe Uvnei Yisrael, which the Yidden recited when they crossed the sea right after leaving Mitzrayim. And for this reason, this Shabbos is referred to constantly with the title Shabbos Shira. The importance of this Shira, the Rebbe went on, we can see from the fact that in our daily davening, we recite daily the Shira. And where did the Chachamim arrange for us to say the Shira? It comes as an introduction to Krishma and Birchas Krishma. Prior that we recite these two major inyanim, we say the Az Yashir daily. So the Shira makes this Shabbos to be referred to as Shabbos Shira. But not only do we find an inyan of Shira in the Kriyas HaTorah, we also find an inyan of Shira in the Haftarah, which was recited this morning in Shul as well. Because the Haftarah for this week's Sedre is the Shira of Dvaira, beginning with the words Vatoshar Dvaira Ubarak Ben Avinoya. And here the Rebbe began explaining how the whole inyan of Haftarah originated. It all began at a time when the Yevonim decreed, they prohibited the reading of the Torah of Parshas HaShavua publicly in Shul. And as the Rebbe explained, how bichlal is it possible that Malchusa Da'ara, a kingdom of this world, can have a shlita, can have a say over an inyan of Torah? We know the Chazal tell us, Istakel Be'araisa Ubara Alma. How was the entire world created? It was all by HaKadosh Baruch Hu looking into Torah, and this is how Bara Alma, he went on to create the world. So here we say that Alma, the world, should come out with a decree that prohibits the reading of the Torah? So the Rebbe explained, we must say that for whatever reason, which is known only to the Rabbeinu Shalom, the royal kingdom of Lamaila also unfortunately agreed to this Gezerah, which prohibited Yidden from reading the Torah publicly in Shul. How long this Gezerah went on, we do not know exactly, but it seems like it went on for more than one Shabbos and more than two. It did go on for some period of time. However, the Yidden found their way out. And being that they were not able to read the Torah publicly, it dawned on them to institute a new idea, which would be that they would select a Perek in Navi, which had a very similar content to the Parsha which was supposed to be read on that Shabbos. And by doing this reminded them on the contents of the Parsha which should have been read on that Shabbos. And that is why the most appropriate Perek in Navi, which was possible to select for Parshas Beshalach, which is Shabbos Shira, was a Perek in Navi which also deals with a Shira. And this is the Perek of the Shiras Devaira. Though later this Gezerah was removed, and the reading of the Torah was again permitted publicly in Shul, however, this inyan of Haftarah remained eternally, and now, in addition to reading the Kriyas HaTorah publicly, we also as well read the Haftarah, which is a chapter in Navi, which has a similar content, something very similar to the Kriyah in the Torah. However, the question arises, what was the logic of the Yevonim at that time, that in Inyan and Kriyas HaTorah, they didn't let the Yidden read. However, in Inyan, in Navi, this was something which they did permit the Yidden to read. And it's something which really is very strange, because the Yevonim knew what was going on. They knew that the Yidden were reading the Haftarah, which is also an Inyan of Torah. But in the Emes, the Rebbe stresses, there's an expression, Arevim alai, or Chavivim alai, Divrei Soifrim, Chazal tell us that Yidden express more love and more dearness to the words of the Nevi'im as opposed to the words that are written in Torah Shebiksav in the Chamisha Chumsha Torah. So, when the Yidden were reading only the Haftarah, which the Haftarah had the contents and the reminder on the Sedra, this is something which they really showed an extra amount of love towards. Based on what Chazal tell us, Chavidim v'areizim alai divrei Kabbalah and divrei Seifrem are very dear and very beloved, more even than the words that are written in Chamisha Chumsha Torah. Rabbi mentioned later in the Farbrengen that there are various categories. There's a category of something which is written beferish in the Pasuk. Then there is divrei Kabbalah, the words what the Nevi'im told us. And then there is what the Chachamim tell us. And then there is something further than that, which is a minhag Yisrael. And there's the famous expression, minhag Yisrael Torah, that a minhag of Yidden has the same validity as any Indian in Torah. And the Alter Rebbe, look at the Torah, explains, not only is minhag Yisrael Torah, not only does it have the same validity as an Indian which is written in Torah, furthermore, the Alter Rebbe there brings one example. Brings an example, hakofis, which we do on Shmini Atzeres. In Hasidic communities, hakofis is performed on Shmini Atzeres as well. This is not a halacha. This is a minhag. It's a minhag Yisrael. And there the Alter Rebbe cites this as an example that this minhag Yisrael reaches further, higher, lamayla, than inyanim that are discussed in Torah Shebal Peh, or even inyanim that are discussed in Torah Shebiksav. There's a special koyach, a special love which the Rebbe shows to inyanim which Yidden accept al minhag, and that is why the expression goes minhag Yisrael Torah. There's an extra special love to this inyan, and that is why it's so treasured and appreciated by the Rabbeinu Shalom. The Alter Rebbe explains that it reaches further than an inyan which is mentioned beferish in Torah Shebiksav. Getting back to our inyan, so the whole idea of Haftarah also shows the love that Yidden had to Torah. In other words, at a time when it was prohibited for them to read Torah because the Yevonim, who had the ruling over them in that generation, did not allow them to do it. So at that time, the Yidden chapzich and an eitzah that they should be able to learn a certain inyan in Torah, which would serve as a reminder for the Parshas HaShavua. And at the same time, this is something which the Goyim let them do. So again, here we see that when Yidden are strongly tied with Torah, the Rebbe goes on, there is nothing, there is no inyan of a decree, there is no inyan of a gzeirah that can separate Chas v'Shalom Yidden from Torah. Even in such circumstances, when there is a gzeirah that does not allow Yidden to learn Torah. So Yidden are ahead of that and create a certain type of a gimmick that they should be able to learn another inyan, Torah, which is substitute for the Parshas HaShavua, and by this they are expressing their love to Torah. And this applies the Negeya each and every week. Here I'm going to refer to another inyan, that there is an expression, when we're talking it applies to every week, there's an expression, Ger shenis gaya tikotn shenoilad, that a Ger who was a Chmegaya, who converted, is like a newborn child. So Rebbe asked the question, Rebbe said the question is mentioned in the Svarad. What's the pshat we compare the Ger to a newborn child? A newborn child, actually, his existence really began prior to that. He was being developed for 9 months while he was still with his mother. So he's not really a new Metzias, he's not really something new. However, when we're talking about the Ger shenis gaya, he just became a Ger today. He just was a Chmegaya. Until now he was a different Metzias. He was a different existence. Until now he was a Metzias of a Goy. And it is now that he's becoming a Yid. The Rebbe explains, no. In Pirkei the Rabbi Lezer it's quoted that when the Rebbe gave the Torah on Har Sinai, all future Gerim were already present then. So in essence, this Ger shenis gaya also originates way back. But it's not something which just took place right now, he became a geir. Furthermore, the Rebbe says, it's brought in Svarim, that when one becomes a geir, it's not some that he becomes the expression is not goyshen is gaya. Every word in Chazal is extremely accurate. If we're talking about somebody who was a goy until now, and now he becomes a geir, the expression should have been goyshen is gaya. So we see Chazal use a different expression. Chazal use the expression gershen is gaya. A geir who was ich megayer is kikot mishanayla. Why is this? The Rebbe explains that really this geir has some sort of a nitzutz, has some sort of a spark within it. A goy does not become a yid, it does not convert himself to a yid. And whenever rarely we do see that a goy converts to be a yid, it's because he has some sort of a spark within him. There's some sort of a nitzutz there. There's something there within him that's bringing about that he should be zech megayer and become a yid. And that is why Chazal use the expression gershen is gayer rather than goyshen is gayer, because goyshen is gayer, there's no such thing. It is gershen is gayer kikot mishanayladam. And again, just like by the cotton, there was some sort of a Metzias prior to that. The same thing, this geir, it originally began by Matan Torah. Because as the Pirkei Rabbi Elazar tells us, that all the geirim were present at Matan Torah. And in more detail, it lets itself be explained because this individual person possessed within him, even while being a goy, some sort of a mitzvah, some sort of a spark, which just brought about that he should go ahead and be zech megaya. After the Rebbe finished the first sikha, he sang a nigun, and the nigun was with the words of Tehillim, Vayanchem lo zetach, v'lo yifachadu v'seiveim kisa hayom. So it came to begin the second sikha. The Rebbe began the second sikha with these words, that the words of Vayanchem lo zetach, v'lo yifachadu v'seiveim kisa hayom are very appropriate for today's Farbrengen. Why? Because where do we find these words? These words we find in Tehillim. Where in Tehillim? At the very end of today's Yom. The very end of today's Yom, Yom Tesvav, finishes off. What said it at the very end? I didn't. In Kapitel Ayin Ches, Pasuk Nun Beis, which is already towards the latter part of the Yom. The latter part of the Yom, which is more the climax of the Yom, there we find these words of Vayanchem lo zetach, v'lo yifachadu v'es'oiveyem kisa hayom. And this the Rebbe explains, David HaMelech is discussing the es'oiveyem, that the enemies, spiritual enemies, kisa hayom, are being covered by the yam, by the water. What's the pshat? Something is being covered by water. So the pshat is the thing is in its existence. However, it is being covered. In other words, at times we destroy something. When we say something is destroyed, we take away its existence. The Rebbe brought an example. There are arba mitzvahs bezdin. 4 ways the way the bezdin used to kill in the times of when the Yad Yisrael Tatifa, when there was a Jewish court, was powerful. There were 4 ways of killing. So either one of the ways, whether it was gila, reifa, hereg, or chanek, meant a total destroying for the person. However, here when we're talking kisa hayom, the enemy is being covered by the water. Is the pshat is the item is here, however it is being covered. By what? By water. What is water? The famous Chazal, the Gemara tells us, Gemara describes that fish have a nature that they constantly have to be within their source of life. What's the source of life of fish? Water. Dogim ha-pershim min hayam, Gemara says, if fish are taken out of water, miyad hin meithem, they cannot exist. So what do we see? That yam reflects a source of existence. When we're talking here, as a vehem kisa hayam, we're taking our oyev, our enemy, and covering it by yam. What does this mean? It means covering, bringing the oyev to the realization of his source, of his mocker.
In other words, that the Oyev also realizes that he was not created by himself, that there is a Beirei Eilam Umanhigoi, there is a Rabbeinu Shalom that created everyone and everything in this world, and the Oyev as well is also realizing this thing. This, the Rebbe carried on, also has a Shaykhah to what Chazarah, to the famous expression of V'hoyu Malachim Omnayach, the Pasuk. The Pharisayim Menikisayach. The Pasuk wants to describe what it's going to look like when Mashiach will come. So the Pasuk uses the expression that the Gentile king will be your servant, and they will be servants. So this is the same idea, the Rebbe says. We're talking of Oyevehem, Kisa Hayam. In other words, the Oyev is the Messiah. The Melech is his existence. However, the Malchi Umay Sa'olam will realize that what is their tachlis of being created, their ultimate reason for being created is to be able to give service to a Yid. They will realize that the Yid is the highest of all of creation. It will be something which will be realized and recognized by everyone, by Goyim as well. And then later, these Goyim will realize that it is a schus for them to be able to be of service to a Yid. So this is the same idea which David HaMelech talks about in Tehillim. As Oyevehem, Kisayah. Going a step further, the Rebbe says, it's the same idea of Bali Tivit. In other words, a person who until now was not acting properly, what does he do now? He turns himself over completely. That's the pshat that we find in the Pasuk, we find him complete with his heart. Actually, the Pasuk could have said, es liboy. Why does the Pasuk say levavoy, plural heart, with both hearts? The Yetzer Tov and the Yetzer Hara. There are two hearts within a person. And the ultimate aim is that it should become that both hearts that are within the person should be totally dedicated to the service of the Rebbe. So this is the whole idea of what the Yom of Teshuvah says. In the Sikha, the Rebbe also refers to an area which he discussed in the Yitzhak Farbrengen. Yitzhak, past Monday night, the Rebbe discussed how different the educational system was in Mitzrayim as opposed to its change after the Yidden left Mitzrayim. And the Rebbe explained that the Sikha of Mitzrayim was, Mitzrayim at that time was highest philosophy of nations. The people there were very learned and very educated. Even if we look into Chumash, we find that there was a meaning of Chartumei Mitzrayim, there was Chachmei Mitzrayim, the intelligent people of Mitzrayim, the intellectual people of Mitzrayim. However, they believed in a philosophy that it is not for everyone. There are a selected group of people who deserve this higher and better education. However, to say that this education is open for all, this was not the shitta, this was not the view and the philosophy which was prevailing in those days. Today the Rebbe explains a little bit more in detail that even the Israelites, in other words the children of Yaakov, who in those days lived in Mitzrayim, also believed in the same philosophy. After Mitzrayim, when the Rebbe gave the Torah, it automatically changed. The Rebbe instructed right away that the Torah is something which has to be given to all of Klal Yisrael. There's no such thing that a certain segment within Yidden learn Torah, and the rest of them have no shaykhs to Torah. Torah, once the Rebbe gave it at Har Sinai, became an inheritance to each and every Yid. Every Yid has an equal shaykhs to Torah. However, prior to Matan Torah, it was limited. Rebbe says, based on what he explained in the Yitzhak Farbrengen, seems like a question reached the Rebbe within a couple of days. And one of the questions was that there's a famous Chazal, Mother tells us, Ma'olam le'paska yeshiva ma'aveteinu. That yeshiva, learning Torah, has never stopped from our ancestors. And the Gemara goes on into detail. The Gemara explains. Avram was learning Torah. Yitzchak was learning Torah. Yaakov as well was learning Torah. Even before Yaakov entered Mitzrayim, what did he do? That Yehuda, Shalach Lefanav, he sent Yehuda, that Yehuda should found the yeshiva in Mitzrayim. So if Chazal tell us, Ma'olam lo paska yeshiva ma'aviseinu, so automatically we see that this was a concept which even while our ancestors were in Mitzrayim, they were also learning Torah. The Rebbe explains, in this sentence of Chazal, we find the response to the question. Chazal tell us, Ma'olam lo paska yeshiva ma'aviseinu, from my ancestors. In other words, those that go into the category of being considered aviseinu. In other words, it wasn't a general thing that all of the Israelites, all the children of Yaakov, children and grandchildren of Yaakov were learning Torah. Me'aviseinu, those who can be considered and credited aviseinu, those who can deserve the title that they are aves, those were the ones that were learning Torah. In other words, the selected group of Yaakov's children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren were learning Torah. However, all of Klal Yisrael was not learning Torah. And the Rebbe brought an obvious example. There's a medrash. The Medrash tells us that the Rebbe made a mess in the evening of Erev Pesach, rather. He brought about a very strong wind, and this special wind took the reyach of the Korban Pesach, the odor of the Korban Pesach, which was in Moshe Rabbeinu's house, and carried it throughout all of Mitzrayim, and it reached all the Yidden. The Yidden began smelling something which was so delicious, they came running to Moshe Rabbeinu, what is it? So Moshe Rabbeinu told them, the reyach is the odor of the Korban Pesach. So they asked, why can't we have? So he told them that in Korban Pesach, only the ones who are gemalt, those who are circumcised, can eat in the Korban Pesach. And those of you who are not circumcised cannot eat in the Korban Pesach. So they immediately volunteered to be circumcised, as long as they should be able to participate in the Korban Pesach. This is what the Chazal tell us. The Damayich, Chayim, that there were two kinds of blood on the evening of Pesach. There was the Dam Milah as well as the Dam Pesach. From this we see the Rebbe says how ignorant the Yidden were in Mitzrayim. It's hard to say, the Rebbe says, that it's something that as a matter of spite, they just did not want to maul their children, maul themselves and their children throughout all the years that they lived in Mitzrayim. So we must come to a conclusion that it wasn't a matter of spite, it was a matter simply of not knowing. They were not everyone who was the children of Yaakov and great children of Yaakov was privileged to learn Torah. And therefore, though the union of Milah was something which was commanded to Avram Avinu and went from Avram to his children straight throughout all the generations, did not reach them simply because of ignorance. They were not around learning Torah, and that is why they were not circumcised. So for this reason, it was only when Moshe Rabbeinu brought it to their attention, that is when they circumcised themselves. And this, the Rebbe says, as it seems from the Medrash, involved quite a number of Yidden that were in the time. The majority of Yidden that were in the time in those days. What do we see from this? That the end for everyone having the Shaykhus to Torah was something which began after Matan Torah. However, prior to Matan Torah, this end did not exist. Was takanin of Ma'olam Le'Paska Yeshiva Me'Aviseinu. Only Aviseinu were involved in the learning of Torah. However, everyone, all of Klal Yisrael, the expression goes, Ram Rasheichem Shiftechem, Through Chayte V'Tzecha V'Sheir Mamecha, involving everybody from top to bottom. This is something which was not in existence until the Rebbe introduced it by Matan Torah. Later in the Sikha, the Rebbe referred to another union.
The Rebbe says there is a question which is being asked to Lubavitcher Chassidus based on what he speaks about recently. And the Rebbe says that when a Lubavitcher Chassid is asked this question, he immediately gets scared. That is his reaction. The Rebbe in recent Farbrengens has been stressing, and primarily in the big Farbrengens, has been stressing our obligation not only to Yidden, but we have an obligation to Goyim as well. There's an inyan of Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach, 7 mitzvahs which Goyim are commanded to adhere to, and it is our obligation to see to it that whenever we come into contact with a Goy who we can utilize our influence on, to see to it that the Goy gets involved in adhering to these 7 mitzvahs as well. So the Rebbe said that there's a question which is created, and this question is the Yetzirah in a Streimel and in a Seidene Kapata. This is a famous expression that at times the Yetzirah could pose like a Frumme Yid. And asks this question to Lubavitcher Chassid, how can you say that we have an obligation to utilize our influence on Goyim at the time we have not corrected all the Yidden yet? So why should we be concerned about Goyim? So Rebbe says the response to this question is not to get scared, but we have an open response to it. The Rambam, who is the one who is teaching us our halachas. The Sefer, the name of the Sefer, the Rambam, is Mishnah Torah. Rebbe mentioned the name of this, the Rambam gave the Sefer is Mishnah Torah. However, this is not the name that the Sefer adopted. When anybody wants to refer to the Rambam, we do not refer to the Rambam by the title of Mishnah Torah. Similarly, the Rebbe brought an example, is Benegei de Shalah. Shalah HaKadosh, it abbreviates Shnei Luchos Habris. That's what he named the Sefer. Still nobody refers to his Sefer as the Shnei Luchos Habris. They abbreviated it by the name of Shalah. In other words, it's a name which is like, may I use the expression, a little bit bigger than what the Sefer is. I mean, Chas v'Chalila, we're not, who are we to minimize the chshivas of the Sefer? But at the same time, to refer to a Sefer, Shnei Luchos Habris, that this Sefer is the two Luchos, is a little bit strange. So that is why the world did not accept this name. The same applies Benegei Rambam. To a Chumash Dvarim is called Mishnah Torah. It's a repeat of Torah. It's a summary of Torah. We should say that a Sefer which was written by an individual should have the same name as Chumash Dvarim, Mishnah Torah, something which is people did not accept. However, at the same time, this does not minimize, at the least, the greatness of the Rambam. And anything which is mentioned in the Rambam, we know is a requirement, is a halachic requirement from us that we have to adhere to it. Especially we all believe in the coming of Mashiach, and we know that when Mashiach will come, the complete world will change. As we say every day in davening, L'sakein olam b'malchus shin daled yud. The world will become uplifted and set up in such a way that it will be ready and willing to accept the ruling of shin daled yud of the Rebbeinu Shalom. So we must say that this is something which will not only affect Yidden, but anyone and everyone who's living in the world. Olam, l'sakein olam, the entire world has to be changed and be brought under Malchus Shin Daled Yud. So therefore, now that we are living in this generation, which is the closest to the coming of Mashiach, it is our obligation to utilize our influence not only on Yidden, but on Goyim as well. The Rebbe began talking that when we come into contact with a Goy, it seems to us that we come into, the reason for the contact is that we should be able to make a couple of dollars with him, and not only make a couple of dollars, but perhaps even swindle him. But this is not the real reason why we're coming into contact with him. The real reason why we are coming into contact with this individual is that we should be able to show him and demand from him how he should act in his life and utilize our influence on this individual. Not that when we come into contact with Goyim, we should begin feeling some sort that we feel lower than the Goy, and we have to look up to the Goy. We say in davening, Ata v'chartonu mikol ha'anim, v'roimamtonu mikol loshain. The Rebbe says, so this individual begins thinking to himself, das steht in Siddur. That's in the Siddur. And he'll leave that in the Siddur. However, when he comes into contact with the Goy, he's looking for all means and ways he should be able to be noisechein, to be able that the Goy should look up to him. And he reminds himself immediately that there are all types of stories, how in the times of the Pritzim, Yidden, those were unfortunate times for Yidden. Yidden were forced to begin dancing in front of Goyim. So, Rebbe says, to begin dancing in front of a Goy on Wall Street is very unsuitable and very unethical. But as far as possible, the spiritual idea of dancing towards the Goy, in other words, to give nach the Goy, whatever the Goy would want, and the Rebbe expressed himself, it's very unfortunate, but to give in to the Goy on inyone harashus, on inyonim which are not osar al pidin, this the Yid is right away ready to. The unfortunate part is that not only do we give in to Goyim on inyone harashus, we are willing to give in to a Goy even on inyonim which we are not allowed to al pi Shulchan Aruch, as long as that the Goy should look up to us and we should be noisechein. In other words, we should become beloved and liked by the Goy so that we should be able to make a couple of dollars on him and swindle him on a couple of dollars. But the Rebbe says this is not the real reason for our contact with the Goy. The reason for our contact with the Goyim is that we should be able to take enough parnasa as well, and parnasa in an honest way,
in a way as it is required of the Shulchan Aruch, and at the same time, to be able to bring our influence to the Goyim, that the Goyim should also act as it's suitable for the Bnei Noach to act in this world. In the Sikha, in the second Sikha, which was quite a long Sikha, the Rebbe also spoke about the importance of Hafatzas HaMayonis, spreading the Inyanim of Hasidus. And the Rebbe said, this is the Tzad HaShod. Every generation, every period has its Inyan, we're supposed to excel in that time. What we are to excel in nowadays is the Inyan of Hafatzas HaMayonis, bringing about the wellsprings of Chassidus, Rozin, and Rozin the Rozin, the secrets of Torah, which this is Chassidus, to bring the Rozin and Rozin of Torah, that it should reach to the Chutzah, to the outside, to those Yidden who until now are not familiar with the whole Inyan of Chassidus, or not only not Chassidus, the idea of Torah in general and Yiddishkeit in general. And naturally, the Rebbe stressed, being that we know Godol Talmud Shemedi Lidei Ma'isa, the whole greatness of learning is because learning brings to doing. In other words, what we mean by doing is the fulfilling of the mitzvahs, observance of the mitzvahs. So it is our obligation, and this Tekufa in our generation, to reach out to those Yidden who are not yet familiar with the whole Inyan of Chassidus, or who are not familiar with the whole Inyan of Yiddishkeit. Take the Rozin, the secrets of Torah, and bring it into the Chutzah, bring it into the outside world. And together with it, not only just the teaching of Chassidus, but the teaching of Chassidus also calls for the mindset, for the action, for the involvement and fulfillment of all the mitzvahs. The Rashi in this week's Sedra, which is in Parshas Beshalach, was not on a specific one pasuk, but the Rebbe involved several psukim in this week's Sedra. And primarily, in this week's Sedra, it is mentioned several times the Amud Ha'onon and the Amud Ha'esh, the clouds that protected the Yidden while the Yidden walked out of Mitzrayim. And for the 40 years that the Yidden were wandering in the desert, they had clouds surrounding them. The first time we come across the clouds is at the beginning of the Sedra. Pasuk Chaf Aleph. Vashem hoylech lefneihem yoimam ba'amud onon an choysam haderech. There was the cloud during the day, as well as the Amud Ha'esh, the Laila ba'amud Eish, v'hoyer lahem laleches yoimam v'layla. So that they should have light while traveling in the desert. There was the Amud Ha'esh. There was a cloud of fire. Pasuk goes on, lo yonish amud ha'onon yoimam v'amud ha'esh layla lefnei ha'am. He never let the Yidden alone. In other words, always during the day there was this cloud of the Amud Ha'onon, and always during the night there was this cloud of fire constantly with the Yidden. If we look into Rashi on these psukim, we don't find any detailed explanation what this Amud Ha'onon and Amud Ha'esh was like. And obviously, for the child who is learning Chumash, and here's the idea of the Amud Ha'onon and the Amud Ha'esh, what does he visualize in his mind? What is this Amud Ha'onon and what is this Amud Ha'esh? It's like a beam of fire, and like a cloud in the format of a beam as well. That is how the child would imagine if he were to type the word Amud Ha'esh and Amud Ha'onon. Let us go further into the subject. If we go into Kapitel Yud Daled, Pasuk Yutef, that's after Shlishi, we again find mention about the Amud Ha'onon and Amud Ha'esh. Here we read how Pari was chasing after the Yidden. Pari changed his mind. He wasn't willing that the Yidden should leave Mitzrayim. He chased after them. Vayisa malach olakim ha'olech l'fnei machane Yisrael vayelach machareim. Vayisa Amud Ha'onon mipneihem vayamid machareim. What do we find in Rashi? that this Amud Ha'anam, this beam, which was in the form of the cloud, which was in the form of a beam, separated between the Mitzrim and the Yidden. And all the bullets, the Chitim of Listerois, which Rashi uses the expression, which the Mitzrim wanted to aim into the Yidden, this cloud absorbed within it. Understood? Let us imagine what's happening. The Jewish camp is a camp of 600,000 people, male only, from age 20 to 60. Which means there were people below 20, there were women, there were children. Now we're saying that the cloud is forming a separation between the Jewish camp and the camp of the Mitzrim. It's ridiculous to say that all the cloud looks like is that the cloud is in the format of a beam, and there's one beam which is separating between these two huge camps. This beam is absorbing all the bullets, all the chitim and the blisterois, which the Mitzrim are aiming at the Yidden, is all absorbed by what? By this beam. What's going on here? We need a gigantic wall in the width which should separate between the Mitzrim and the Yidden. And if we say we need something which should be absorbent to absorb all the bullets, something actually which should be like bulletproof, that whatever the Mitzrim are aiming on the Yidden should not reach the Yidden, that means it has to cover them from all sides. Because by nature, whenever there's a Mulchama, whenever there's any type of an Indian going on, and if the Mitzrim wanted to aim on the Yidden, and they really wanted to get the Yidden, what would they do? True, there's an Anon here, they would go to the side, they would go to one side, they would go to another side, as long as they should be able to get the Yidden. So the Pasuk tells us, Rashi explains, no, you should know the Amud Anon, what did such a job, that any type of bullet, any type of chait, or blisterois, which the Mitzrim wanted to aim on the Yidden, was protected by the Amud Anon. It's a new Perush in the Amud Anon. Not finished yet. Let us go to the end of the Sedra. The end of the Sedra is where Amalek came to start up with the Yidden. Vayoyim Moshe al Yeshua, it's the end of the Sedra, Kapitel Yud Zayin Pasuk Tes. Moshe says to Yeshua, B'char lanu anoshim, select the right people, v'tzei hilochem ba'Amalek, and go and have Mulchama with Amalek. What's the pshat, v'tzei and go? Where should you go from? So there's a Rashi. What does Rashi say? Tzei min ha'anam, go out of the cloud. In other words, here the cloud is already a different concept. It's something which is surrounding them obviously from all four sides, and we say go out of the cloud. Otherwise, why do you go out of the cloud? If the cloud is something which was only on one side, or only some sort of a beam on one side where the Yidden rested, where the Yidden camped, why do they have to go out of the cloud in order to go and have Mulchama with Amalek? So from this Rashi here, it seems that the cloud was something which surrounded them from all sides. And if this is what the Amud Anon was, why doesn't Rashi say this right away at the beginning? As soon as there's mention of the existence of an Amud Anon, an Amud Aish, Rashi should tell us, you should know the Amud Anon was something which surrounded the Yidden from all four corners. In other words, as soon as the child comes into contact with the existence of the Amud Anon and the Amud Aish, Rashi should have familiarized us and tell us exactly what the Amud Anon is all about. Rashi does it in 3 different portions, and each time differently. In the beginning, Rashi says nothing. Later, Rashi says that the Amud Anon was some sort of a wall between the Yidden and the camp of the Yidden and the camp of the Mitzrim. Now already we see that the Amud Anon was something yet more than that. It was something which surrounded the Yidden from all four sides. So we find the Rashi in this week's Sedra that when the Mitzrim came, the Yidden weren't able to see them. Why, obviously? Because they were surrounded with the clouds. There was the Amud Anon. This is way back at the beginning of the Sedra, Kapitel Yud Dalet Pasuk Yud.
What did they see? V'hine Mitzrayim noisei achareim. So the pasuk says noisei achareim. The pasuk should have used the expression noisei achareim. The Mitzrayim plurally are running after the Yidden. Why does the pasuk say noisei achareim? So Rashi says b'leiv echad k'ish echad. They were all united after the Yidden. That's one pshat. Davar acha. V'hine Mitzrayim noisei achareim. Ro sar shel Mitzrayim noisei min hashamayim lazer leMitzrayim. But what the Yidden saw, they saw that every nation has its malach, has its sar. So the Yidden saw the sar of Mitzrayim. Actually, the Mitzrayim they were not able to see. Something very strange. There is a cloud between these two camps. Such a cloud, I mean, a child knows what a cloud looks like. A cloud could blur up something. However, when we have an entire nation, Paroi and the Mitzrayim are all running after the Yidden. So we say the Mitzrayim, they weren't able to see. Why? Because they were surrounded by the Amud Ha'onon. The Amud Ha'onon protected them, so that you shouldn't be able to see the Mitzrayim. In other words, the whole idea of the Amud Ha'onon was that the Yidden should feel safe. They shouldn't be frightened by the Mitzrayim. So if the Rebbeishter is making this net to protect the Yidden and to calm the Yidden, that the Yidden shouldn't feel frightened by the Mitzrayim, and that is why the Yidden didn't see the Mitzrayim. Something very strange. Thousands and thousands of people are running after them, they can't see them. Why can't they see them? Because there's an Amud Ha'onon blocking. The Sarah Shel Mitzrayim, they were able to see. The same Rabbeinu Shalom, who's performing these many nisim for them, could have made a yet larger nest, that not only they shouldn't see the Mitzrayim, they also shouldn't see the Sarah Shel Mitzrayim. And the Yidden shouldn't get frightened at all. Basically, what the Rebbe explained was the klal in Rashi is, Rashi explains an Inyan as needed. Let me put an example. For instance, if Rashi will have a contradiction between two psukim. A pasuk in Bereshis will contradict a pasuk in Dvarim. Where will Rashi raise this question? In Bereshis or in Dvarim? No, in Dvarim. Because as long as the child is learning Bereshis, there's no contradiction. However, once the child reaches Chumash Dvarim, and in Chumash Dvarim there's a contradiction between a pasuk in Dvarim and a pasuk in Bereshis, this is where Rashi feels obligated to explain the stira. In other words, Rashi explains the inyanim as needed, as aroused. As the inyanim arise, that is when Rashi explains. Let us keep in mind another inyan. Whenever the Rebbeishter performs a nest, the Rebbeishter performs the nest in accordance to what the nest is, how the nest is needed. The Rebbeishter will not perform a nest more than it's needed either. It's explained in Chassidus, and the Rebbe refers to it many times, because the whole idea of the nes is to go against the gevulos, against the boundaries of Teva, nature. So whatever is needed at this time, the Rebbeishter does. If at a later occasion we will require a yet larger nest in this Inyan, the Rebbeishter will do it. However, the expression, there's an expression in Daran, one of the Rishonim. Kutshabrichu lo yovid nisa lemagone. The Rebbeishter will not make a nest without any reason. The same thing applies to the size of the nest. The Rebbeishter, as we will see in this Inyan in a minute, the Rebbeishter gives us the Inyan of the nest in accordance as we need it. So when the Rebbeishter took the Yidden out of Mitzrayim and the Yidden began traveling, there was an Inyan of Amud Ha'onon. So the first time the pasuk mentions Amud Ha'onon and Amud Ha'esh,
it's not that they were surrounded with a cloud from all four sides, as well as they were not surrounded with a fire from all four sides. Because the Rebbe says in Pshuta Shel Mikra, if they would be surrounded with fire from all four sides, fire burns. Fire would do damage. So we must say that there was only an Amud Ha'esh, like a beam of fire, which was heading them to bring light to them while they were walking at night. As a need aroused, the Rebbeishter had to go ahead and make another inyan. The Mitzrayim began chasing the Yidden. So here the Rebbeishter had to take the Amud Ha'onon and expand this Amud Ha'onon, something which initially was not needed. He expanded the Amud Ha'onon to the extent that the Amud Ha'onon should absorb all the chitzim of blisterois, all the bullets which the Mitzrim aimed at the Yidden. This does not mean that the Amud HaOnon had to be shaped in a very long wall, because if it would be a long wall, then the Mitzrim could go to this side or to that side. The Rebishter made a ness that wherever the Mitzrim aimed at the Yidden, there was the Amud HaOnon, and the Amud HaOnon right then and there absorbed this bullet which was aimed at the Yidden. So it was something additional within the Amud HaOnon that the Amud HaOnon had to perform another ness which the Rebishter made. That the Amud HaOnon had to absorb all the chitzim ublisterois which were aimed at the Yidden. Then we come weiter by Amalek. Amalek wanted to start up with all the Yidden. So the Rebishter at that time had to surround all the Yidden with the Amud HaOnon, because this was required at that time, to save the Yidden from Amalek. And when Yeshua Moshe told Yeshua to go ahead and take Yidden, to go and have Mulchama with Amalek, these Yidden had to go outside of the Onon. They were surrounded at that time by the Onon totally, and go out of the Onon, same in HaOnon, v'hilochem ba'Amalek. But this does not mean that the Onon was surrounding them at any given time. As they began leaving Mitzrayim, there was an Onon surrounding them, and if the Yidden wanted to go out, there was an Indian of Tzeimin Onon. In other words, the Onon, the Rebishter used as a means of protecting the Yidden at every given time accordingly as it was needed. Rabbi referred to another Indian, that there is a Ulta. The Mechilta tells us that there were many Ananim. There was not only one Anan. Mechilta says that there were 7 Ananim. And he brings an opinion, not only 7, he brings an opinion of 14 Ananim. So the Mechilta is not quoted by Rashi. So obviously in Pshuta Shel Mikra, Rashi does not adhere to this whole shitta. In Pshuta Shel Mikra there was one Anan. The Mechilta claims there were many Ananim. There were 14 Ananim. These 14 Ananim, according to the Mechilta, could have been surrounding the Yidden, could have been one coat upon one on top of the other, and so forth. However, Rashi does not accept this shit. Rabbi brother Rabbeinu Bechaya. Rabbeinu Bechaya in Pashas Boy tells us, where the Torah tells us about HaChodesh Hazel Lachem Rosh Chodoshim, that about the new moon coming every month. So Rabbeinu Bechaya there tells us that not always were the Yidden able to set the new month with witness seeing the new moon. And he brings an example when the Yidden were in Mitzrayim. The Yidden were in Mitzrayim, they were surrounded with the Ananim, they were surrounded with the clouds. So if they were surrounded with the clouds, they weren't able to see the moon, the new moon or the old moon, as the month changed. So at that time, they had to come on to a calculation, keep a cheshbon, in order to know when the new month began. The Rabbeinu Bechaya explains, for the same reason that when the Yidden knew that 7 times the Amud HaOnon and 7 times the Amud HaEish, they knew that a week passed, and so forth. The Rebbe says it seems like Rashi in Pshuta Shel Mikra does not accept this Rabbeinu Bechaya. Because if we're talking about the Rabbeinu Shalom, who's performing Nisim here, the Amud HaOnon could have been the same safety Amud HaOnon, and at the same time they were able to look through it. It's something which the Rebishter is creating as a nest. It's not something natural in this world. It's something which the Rebishter created as a miracle. So he could have created the same Amud HaOnon and should be a visible Amud HaOnon. And if the Yidden would have to see when the new moon shines, in order to know when the new month begins, they were well able to see it. And the Rebbe brings a raya from Pshuta Shel Mikra that we have to learn this way. We find weiter in Chumash that while the Yidden were in Mitzrayim, I think it was by the Slav, the Cham HaShemesh v'Nomas. The sun began shining very hard, and it melted. If the Yidden were constantly surrounded by a cloud, by such a cloud which did not allow them to see the new moon, something which kept them isolated from the entire surroundings, how was it possible that when the sun shined very strongly, that something melted? So we must say that this whole Indian of the Anan was something which was definitely visible, and if the Rabbeinu Bechaya is not bound to learn in Pshuta Shel Mikra, as well as the Mechilta is also not bound to learn in Pshuta Shel Mikra. However, the way Rashi learns, we are bound to learn in Pshuta Shel Mikra that this whole Indian of the Ananim was something, being that was created by the Rabbeinu Shalom, the Rabbeinu Shalom as well was able to create it, that the Yidden should be able to see through it as well. And at the same time, the Amud Anon should be able to perform all the protection for the Yidden as well. Every Yidden in Torah has its Hayrah, the lesson which we can derive from it as well. And here the Rebbe refers to the end of the Sedra. We are talking about the Milchama with Amalek. The Milchama with Amalek is not a one-time thing, it is something eternal. There's a Milchama L'Hashem ba'Amalek midor doyer. And constantly there are those Yidden that are within the clouds. In other words, those Yidden that are protected. Amalek will never be able to reach these Yidden. And here the Rebbe brought an example. Someone who was fortunate to learn in Tomchei Mimim, learned in the yeshiva of Tomchei Mimim, and this, the Rebbe says, wasn't even by his own choice. He was fortunate that when he was young and didn't even have his own say, didn't even have his own opinion, his parents, for whatever reason, selected to send him to give him a proper education at a meiser like Tomchei Mimim. And this person is living up to the standards of Tomchei Mimim. That even when he left the four walls of Tomchei Mimim and he's running a life of his own, he's running it in a way of Yigia kapecha ki soichal ashrecha v'toivlach. This is an inyan which is explained in Hasidus. There's a pasuk, Yigia kapecha ki soichal ashrecha v'toivlach, meaning if you will eat the labor and toil of your hands, blessed is this person, praised is this person. So Hasidus proves from this that when a person is involved in his occupation, in any worldly things, it should be in a format of Yigia kapecha. Kapayim means the hands. Hands are usually secondary to his intellect, to his mind. In other words, his prime concern is in Inyanim Ruchnim. His roish is in Inyanim Ruchnim, in learning and davening and so forth. However, he also has to earn a living and sustain himself and his family. So this is something secondary to him, and this is expressed as Yigia kapecha, but not Yigia Rishecha. So we're talking about a Yid who's living up to a standard of Yigia kapecha kisoichal ashrecha v'toivlach. However, what is his roish involved in? His roish is involved in inyanim that Tomchei Mimim taught him. In other words, even after he left the four walls of Tomchei Mimim and he's running his own personal life, whenever he has a free minute, a free moment, he's trying to fill his mind with inyanim of Tomchei Mimim. That means inyanim that he learned in yeshiva. And we're talking about such type of an individual who can be classified as best, that he's surrounded with the cloud all around him. So this Yid has to know that a time comes when the Moshe of the generation comes. As the Zohar uses the expression, is pashtusa de Moshe b'chol dara v'dara, in every generation there is its Moshe Rabbeinu. And the Moshe Rabbeinu of our generation, as the Rebbe said in the Farbrengen, is the Friedeke Rebbe, the Nasi Yisrael. The Rebbe always keeps on referring to the Friedeke Rebbe as the Nasi Yisrael. But to us it is the Rebbe soll gesund sein, who is the Moshe, the Pashtusa, the Moshe b'chol dara v'dara. And here the Moshe is demanding to us the same Moshe who is the Nasi, the Menahel Poyel of Tomchei Mimim. He is the Menahel Poyel, the Dean of Tomchei Mimim, where we learned. And years later, this is Pashtusa, the Moshe Shebechol Dara V'Dara, the Moshe Rabbeinu of this generation comes to us and tells us that the time has reached when we have to go outside of the clouds. In other words, we are taka protected. Amalek cannot do us any harm. But there are Yidden who are not surrounded with these clouds. There are Yidden who are outside and outside of the clouds, and Amalek can affect these Yidden and weaken these Yidden. And if we will not go outside from our clouds to protect these Yidden who are on the outside, then Amalek will chas v'sholem destroy these Yidden. So we are to know that there is a time when Vayomer Moshe el Yeshua, the Moshe of our generation, tells us, Tzei hilochem ba'Amalek. We have to go out of our clouds, we have to go out of our own daladames, go out into the outside world where there's an Amalek who is trying to destroy the Yidden that are on the outside, and it is our obligation to roll up our sleeves and have a battle with Amalek. Tzei hilochem ba'Amalek. Go out of the Anan, Tzeimin Anan, go out of this Amud Anan, the spiritual cloud that's protecting us and guarding us, and the Hilochim by and have Mulchama with Amalek. This is the Hirah, this is the lesson which we take from this week's Parsha, from this whole Inyan of the Amud Anan and the Amud Aish. Later in the Farbrengen, the Rebbe referred to as Zohar, as usual, in the Farbrengens. The Rebbe also spoke about the importance, on the other hand, of not utilizing bad influence on people. And here I referred to an Indian where one can chas v'shalom be a megala panim b'toyra shaloika halacha. In other words, bring about pshatim in Torah which are not in accordance with halacha. The Rebbe stressed every word in Chazal is accurate. He is megala, he is revealing panim. Panim means the face of Torah. In other words, he's somebody who's really involved well in the learning of Torah. However, it is shaloi halacha. What does that mean? There's a Gemara that tells us, "V'Hashem imay shehalacha kemoisei." When somebody is zeicha that the halacha is like him, it means that Hashem is with him. In other words, if this individual is megala panim b'Torah shaloi halacha, it means he's lacking the Hashem with him in the learning of Torah. The Rebbe spoke about it a lot of Admas Nefesh, that there are some people that claim they have the Torah, they possess the Torah in their back pocket. However, what they forget is that there is long a hole in their back pocket, and the Torah fell out through that hole. And they still think that they're walking around with the Torah in their back pocket. However, these people, though that through wrong images they may be able to bring about many unsatisfactory inyanim, because of the fact that they think that they know Torah, they think they have a shaychus to panim shel Torah, and they are megala panim shel Torah, however, it's shaloi halacha. But it says even for those people, there is still a hope, because shari tshuva lo ninalu, the gates of tshuva are not locked, shari d'mois lo ninalu, the gates of tears are not locked, and Memela the Rebishter will always accept back even such a person who has gone around and created in the name of Torah false images and in Yanim of Torah. This person also has an open door waiting for him to do tshuva as well. The Rebbe expressed himself that what could be that through this person there are still lebedika averis, living sins walking around on this world. Why? All through his false in Yanim and Torah which he interpreted. So it is his obligation to erase and wipe out all these false impressions which were created through him, and once this will be done, tshuva will be extended even to such a person as well. The Rebbe referred at the end of the Farbrengen to an inyan which he mentioned in last week's Farbrengen as well, that in this week's Sedra we find the great importance of Neshei Yisrael, the Jewish women. We find it in the Chumash, B'negei de Shira. After the Yidden have recited Shira, immediately came Vatosha Miriam. We find in the Haftarah yet more. The Haftarah begins Vatosha Dvaira. Dvaira began the singing, and afterwards Uvarak joined in with the Vaira. So we see that preference is given to the Jewish woman, first the Vaira and later Barak. The Rebbe referred that there is a Kisvei HaArizal. The Kisvei HaArizal tells us that the women in the generation of Geula will be a Gilgul of those women that were in Beis Yitzias Mitzrayim. So naturally the last generation of Golus is automatically the first generation of Gula. So this is the generation that we are in. So the Neshei Yisrael now are a Gilgul of these Nashim Tzidkoniyas that lived in the times of the Golus Mitzrayim. And just like we find by those Nashim Tzidkoniyas, how they excelled B'negei Matan Torah. They excelled B'negei Matan Torah. We find that the Rebishter said, Kol Tzom ala Beis Yaakov, v'sagid l'bnei Yisrael. The Rebishter gave preference to the Neshei Yisrael who are referred to as Beis Yaakov, and then v'sagid l'bnei Yisrael. We find the same when it came to contribute for the Mishkan. The women contributed with much more warmth and inspiration than the men. Vayavayu ha'anoshim al anoshim.
And we find the same when it was the Negea, the ego, it was the men who were willing to participate in the ego. However, the women, they were those that refrained from participating in the ego. So just like in that generation, we see how the women excelled to such an extent and such vital and such important in Yonim. So Rebbe demands that it's in our generation as well, the women should excel in all the inyanim of raising a proper generation, in the inyan of pruvu, of having Jewish children and raising them properly and accordingly, and this will bring to the coming of Mashiach b'mheira v'yameinu.